Right, so I've had this thought rattling around in my head for the better part of a year now, and tonight felt like as good a night as any to finally talk it through properly, out loud, the whole thing. It's about Squidward. Squidward tentacles from SpongeBob SquarePants, the permanently irritated octopus with the clarinet who lives in the big stone head wedged between the pineapple and the rock. I went down a Nietzsche rabbit hole I had no business going down at 11:30 on a weeknight a while back, and somewhere in the middle of it, this thought turned up and never really left. I think that cartoon quietly drew one of the more accurate portraits of a very specific kind of unhappiness, and a German philosopher had more or less diagnosed it 100 years before anyone ever sketched that clarinet. I want to say up front, this isn't a takedown of Squidward. If anything, it's the opposite. I've got a real soft spot for him, the same soft spot a lot of adults seem to develop somewhere around their late 20s, when the jokes about hating your job and dreaming of being something else stop being background noise and start landing uncomfortably close to home. So this is more of a long, unhurried wander through who he actually is, what Nietzsche meant by some of his more famous and most misunderstood ideas, and where the two of them line up in ways I found a fair bit funnier and a fair bit sadder than I expected going in. If you're new round here, get comfortable, because this is one of the long, rambling ones. I'm not building towards some big twist at the end. There isn't one. I'm just going to work through this in pieces, the way I'd talk it through with a mate over too many cups of tea, hopping between Squidward's history, some basic Nietzsche for anyone who only knows him from gym poster quotes, and a handful of specific episodes that I reckon prove the point better than I could just by explaining it at you. So if you drift off somewhere around the marching band bit later on, don't worry, you won't have missed an ending. There isn't really one of those either, just a series of small interesting rooms, and I want to take you through them one at a time, at whatever pace feels comfortable to you tonight. Quick bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you're new and fancy more of these long, slow ones, there's a subscribe button down there somewhere. No pressure either way. Right then, let's get into it. Before we get anywhere near Nietzsche, I think it's worth actually introducing Squidward properly, because most people who've watched hundreds of episodes of this show still only really know him as the grumpy one. And there's a surprising amount going on underneath that bulbous head once you start poking around in it. He was created by a bloke called Steven Hillenburg, who's a really interesting case himself, because he wasn't a career animator who happened to fall into ocean stuff. It was the other way round entirely. He studied marine biology in college, with art as his minor, and worked at a place called the Ocean Institute, teaching kids about tide pools before he ever pitched a cartoon to anyone. He'd made a little educational comic for the Institute called the Intertidal Zone, full of anthropomorphic sea creatures, and that's more or less the seed that eventually grew into Bikini Bottom. I like that detail a lot. It means the whole show, Squidward included, came out of someone who'd spent years actually watching how creatures in tide pools behave, long before he ever started drawing jokes about them. Squidward himself turns up in the very first episode, Help Wanted, back in May of 1999, already fully formed, already irritated, already working the till at the Krusty Krab, next to a sponge who is far too pleased about everything. He's voiced by an actor called Roger Bumpass, who's been doing the part for the entire run of the show, which when you actually think about it is a strange kind of professional commitment, spending decades of your working life being annoyed on behalf of a fictional octopus. And he is an octopus for what it's worth, not a squid, whatever the name suggests. Hillenburg apparently designed him as an octopus because he liked the shape of that big round head, reckoned it suited a character who fancies himself an intellectual. The squid in the name is mostly there because it sounded better than the honest alternative, which according to Bumpass would have been something like Octowood. And frankly, he's right, that doesn't work at all. It's one of those tiny naming decisions nobody in the audience probably ever questions. But once you know it, you can't quite unknow it. He's usually drawn with 6 limbs as well. instead of the 8 an actual octopus would have, purely because 8 tentacles were apparently a nightmare to animate consistently. So somewhere along the line, the animators just quietly dropped 2 of them and got on with the episode. He does briefly get the full 8 in a couple of specific outings, but for the vast majority of the show, he's wandering around Bikini Bottom 2 tentacles short, and nobody in universe ever mentions it once. That feels like exactly the sort of thing that wouldn't survive a modern animated pitch meeting. Somebody would absolutely flag it as a continuity note, and I'm rather glad nobody did. He lives in a house shaped like a moai, one of those big stone heads from Easter Island, sandwiched directly between SpongeBob's pineapple and Patrick's rock, which on paper is one of the more unhinged pieces of suburban planning you'll find anywhere in children's television. 3 completely different households, 3 wildly incompatible aesthetics, none of it zoned sensibly in the slightest, and Squidward stuck dead in the middle of the 2 loudest neighbours imaginable, with no say whatsoever in how any of it came to be. I think about that more than is probably healthy, the sheer bad luck of it. He didn't choose this arrangement. He just woke up one day living between a pineapple and a rock, and seems to have been quietly furious about it ever since. Inside that stone head, alongside the easels and the half-finished self-portraits we'll get to properly in a little while, there's the clarinet. He actually gives it a name, which I find oddly touching. He calls it Clary, and by several accounts he sleeps with it in his bed, like you'd sleep with a teddy bear. There's something almost childlike tucked away in that detail. This otherwise prickly, sarcastic, deeply unimpressed adult who still tucks his clarinet in at night without a hint of irony. It's about the one unguarded thing in an otherwise very guarded character, and I think it tells you more about him than most of his actual dialogue does. Personality-wise, the show's been fairly consistent about him across the decades. He's short-tempered, he's snobbish, he's sarcastic in a way that reads as actually witty rather than just unkind. And he's almost permanently put upon, mostly by the 2 neighbours either side of him. What's interesting, and what I think gets missed if you only ever half-watch this as background noise while doing the washing up, is that SpongeBob and Patrick are completely oblivious to how much Squidward actually dislikes them. They think he's their friend. They're not being deliberately thick about it either. They genuinely don't register the sighing, the slammed doors, years of barely concealed contempt. Because as far as they're concerned, you spend your days around someone. That someone is your mate. Simple as that. There's no second layer to it for them. For Squidward, there's nothing but second layers. I read a quote once from Tom Kenny, who voices SpongeBob, where he said Squidward's the character he personally finds most interesting, precisely because of that gap. He said SpongeBob and Patrick have this total effortless capacity for play that completely mystifies Squidward, and underneath all the irritation, he's a bit jealous of it. Every time Squidward actually tries to join in on their nonsense, he fails completely. Not because he's clumsy or untalented exactly, but because some part of him simply doesn't believe in it the way they do. He can't access it from the inside. He can only ever watch it happen from just outside the glass. That's the bit I want us to sit with for a minute, because I think it's the whole engine of the character, and we'll be coming back round to it from a few different angles tonight. It's not simply that Squidward is miserable while his neighbours are happy. It's that their happiness looks effortless to him, looks almost insultingly easy, and he can't work out how to get any of it for himself, no matter how much culture or taste or talent he tells himself he's got over them. There's a detail from one of the show's longtime writers that I quite like as well, sitting alongside that. She said Squidward was the character on the whole show she related to most, more than any of the actual cheerful ones, which on the surface sounds like an odd thing for a children's television writer to admit. But sit with it for a second and it makes complete sense. SpongeBob's joy isn't really something most adults can relate to directly. It's something we watch from a slight distance and find charming, a bit like watching a toddler get more delight out of a cardboard box than the actual toy that came inside it. Squidward's frustration, though, the daily grind of a job he doesn't love, the unfinished side project he keeps meaning to get back to, the perfectly nice neighbours who somehow always turn up at the worst possible moment. That's not charming from a distance. That's just an ordinary Tuesday for an awful lot of us. A small bit of trivia I rather like, while we're still getting properly acquainted with him. The name itself is a bit of a Frankenstein job, cobbled together from the word squid and the very ordinary English name, Edward, which is a strange little detail once you notice it, because nothing else in Bikini Bottom gets named quite that way. SpongeBob's surname is just a kitchen object. Patrick doesn't really have one worth mentioning. SquidWard alone gets this oddly specific, almost human construction. Half sea creature, half perfectly ordinary bloke down the pub, which feels weirdly appropriate for a character caught exactly between those two registers, somewhere between a working man clocking in at a fast food counter and a creature who fully believes he's destined for something grander. He's turned up too, well beyond the original series itself, properly central to every theatrical film the franchise has put out over the years. Never quite the lead, always somewhere just off to the side being unimpressed by whatever's going on. I think that's exactly the right amount of him. Too much Squidward and the contempt stops being funny and just becomes wearing. Too little and you lose the whole point of the character, that friction that makes the cheerful bits land properly by contrast. The show seems to understand, instinctively, that he works best in measured doses, which is more than I can say for most of the actual people in my life who remind me of him. There's also just the sheer specificity of how he looks, which gets taken for granted once you've seen him a few hundred times. That particular shade of turquoise, the enormous, slightly drooping nose that's done more comedic heavy lifting across this franchise than arguably any other single feature in children's animation. The permanently lowered eyelids that somehow convey exhaustion and condescension at the exact same time, often within the same single shot. None of that's accidental, obviously, and I think it's worth appreciating properly the way the design itself does half the emotional work before he's even opened his mouth to complain about something. So that's the basic shape of him. Cranky octopus, failed artist in his own head if nowhere else, 2 limbs short, married to a clarinet, sandwiched between a sponge and a starfish he can't stand, and somehow can't quite manage to leave either. Before we get into any of the philosophy properly, I want to spend a bit more time on that dynamic with SpongeBob and Patrick specifically, because I think it's a good deal more interesting and a good deal less simple than grumpy neighbour gets annoyed by silly neighbours. One more bit of trivia before we properly move on, because I think it says something about how deliberately the performance is calibrated. People have compared Roger Bumpass's delivery for the character to Jack Benny, the old American comedian known for playing a famously vain, famously cheap version of himself for laughs. Bumpass himself has mostly waved the comparison off, though he's admitted there's a similar flavour of dry, observational sarcasm running through both. I rather like that the comparison exists at all because it places Squidward in a much older comic tradition than the show itself. The wounded, self-important figure whose vanity is the joke and whose vanity is also, somehow, the thing that makes you fond of him anyway. Anyway, that's the surface of him properly covered, I think. The bits you'd notice on a first watch, even if you weren't paying particularly close attention. Now I want to get into what's actually going on underneath all that, starting with the one relationship that defines basically everything else about how he moves through Bikini Bottom. So here's the thing about Squidward, SpongeBob, and Patrick that I think genuinely gets overlooked, because the show plays it so consistently and so casually that it stops registering as strange after a while. SpongeBob and Patrick are not putting up with Squidward out of some sense of neighbourly duty. They are not gritting their teeth through his moods the way you might with a difficult relative at Christmas. As far as either of them is concerned, the three of them are mates, proper mates. SpongeBob will cheerfully describe Squidward as his best friend in episodes where Squidward has, minutes earlier, said something thoroughly cutting to his face. It doesn't land, it never lands. SpongeBob just absorbs it and carries on, entirely unbothered, because in his head there isn't a version of events where someone you spend that much time around isn't fundamentally fond of you. I find that fascinating, partly because it's clearly meant to be funny, the classic mismatch between how a character sees a relationship and how the audience sees it, and partly because it's a properly accurate bit of observation about how some friendships actually work in real life. We've all known someone who simply will not be deterred from liking you, who reads your sarcasm as banter and your silence as you having a busy week, no matter how plainly you signal otherwise. It's mildly exhausting from the outside. From Squidward's side, I imagine it's something closer to maddening. And to be fair to Squidward, he does eventually, grudgingly, show actual concern for both of them when it counts. He's not written as some kind of irredeemable monster who secretly wishes harm on his neighbours. That would be a much less interesting character and a much less interesting show. When SpongeBob's genuinely upset or actually in danger, Squidward tends to step in, often complaining loudly the entire time about how he can't believe he's doing this, as if narrating his own reluctant kindness out loud somehow makes it count for less. There's a real tenderness buried under there. It's just buried very deep, and Squidward seems to actively resent how often it gets dug up against his will. What I keep coming back to, though, is what this dynamic actually does to Squidward psychologically, because I don't think it's simply that he's annoyed by loud neighbours. I think it's something closer to this. He is surrounded every single day by two creatures who experience joy with no apparent effort and no apparent self-consciousness whatsoever. SpongeBob doesn't have to talk himself into being happy about blowing bubbles. He just is. Patrick doesn't need a reason to find a rock funny. He just does. And Squidward, who has built an entire personality around the idea that he's the sophisticated one, the cultured one, the one with standards, watches this happen constantly from about 3 feet away and cannot, for the life of him, replicate it. That's not really about reef blowers or noise levels. That's about proximity to something you want and can't have, on a loop, indefinitely, with no escape clause built in, because they're literally either side of your house. There's a particular line of thinking in the show's writing, and you can see it in plenty of episodes if you watch with this in mind, where Squidward isn't actually angry that SpongeBob and Patrick are foolish. He's angry that their foolishness keeps working. It keeps making them happy. Meanwhile, his own carefully cultivated taste, his clarinet, his self-portraits, none of that seems to be doing the same job for him, and somewhere under all the sighing, I think he knows it. Now, I've used a couple of words there I haven't properly defined yet, things like taste and standards and cultured, and I want to hang on to those, because they're going to matter a great deal in a little while. For now, I just want to plant the idea that Squidward's misery isn't simply a personality trait he was handed at birth, the way you'd hand a cartoon character a catchphrase. It's a reaction. It's something that happens specifically in response to being surrounded by a kind of happiness he can't access and can't quite explain away either. There's a small mirror to that detail worth flagging too, the way SpongeBob talks about Squidward to other people, entirely separate from how Squidward talks, or rather doesn't talk, about SpongeBob. SpongeBob will introduce him warmly, describe him fondly, defend him without hesitation if anyone outside their little trio has a bad word to say. It's entirely one-directional affection, dressed up as a friendship that, from where Squidward's standing, has never once felt mutual. I think that one-sidedness is doing more work than the show usually gets credit for, because it means Squidward's contempt isn't simply being met with indifference. It's being met constantly with a warmth he can't bring himself to return, which makes the whole arrangement a fair bit sadder than a simple comedy of mismatched neighbours. There's a particular kind of moment that recurs across the show that I think proves this isn't just a bit, isn't just the writers being inconsistent for the sake of a gag. When SpongeBob's truly in trouble, properly frightened or properly hurt rather than just being his usual chaotic self, Squidward's first instinct, however reluctantly delivered, however loudly complained about along the way, is to help. He'll mutter the entire time about how this is the last thing he wanted to be doing with his evening, how he can't believe he's the one having to sort this out. And then he'll sort it out anyway, because apparently some part of him simply can't watch either of his neighbours actually suffer, even after years of being driven up the wall by them on a near daily basis. I think the house itself is doing a fair bit of quiet symbolic work too, now I properly think about it, sitting there wedged between the pineapple and the rock. It's not just a joke about mismatched architecture, it's Squidward's entire situation, made literal, hemmed in on both sides by exactly the kind of unself-conscious joy he can't seem to access himself, with no real means of escape short of moving away entirely, which, as we'll get to a little later tonight, he does eventually try, with results that tell you a great deal about what he's actually chasing. He could move, in theory, nothing's physically stopping him, and yet there he stays, year after year, fictional decade after fictional decade, in the one house in Bikini Bottom, positioned to maximise exactly the kind of daily proximity to joy he claims to find most unbearable. I don't think that's simply bad luck on the show's part, some lazy bit of geography nobody bothered to fix. I think it's the whole premise of the character, quietly built into the actual real estate. There's something almost ritualistic about how consistently this all plays out too. The slammed door, the long-suffering sigh, the muttered complaint about peace and quiet that never actually arrives. It happens so often across so many episodes that it stops reading as plot and starts reading as something closer to a daily liturgy. The small repeated ceremony of a man performing his own irritation for an audience of two who never once seem to notice they're the congregation, which funnily enough is more or less exactly the territory a particular German philosopher spent a good chunk of his career writing about, long before anyone had drawn a single frame of an underwater pineapple. So let's actually go there properly for a bit. Nothing too heavy, I promise. Just enough, so the rest of tonight makes sense. It's worth separating Patrick out from SpongeBob for a moment too, because I don't think they function identically in all this, even though they're often lumped together as a single chaotic unit. SpongeBob's the one Squidward actually works alongside, the one whose enthusiasm he has to tolerate for an entire shift, several days a week, with no real escape until closing time. Patrick's presence is more voluntary on Squidward's part, in a strange way, simply by virtue of where the rock happens to sit. And yet Patrick gets under his skin just as effectively, sometimes more so, precisely because Patrick's happiness requires even less justification than SpongeBob's does. SpongeBob's at least excited about specific things, jellyfishing, bubble blowing, his job. Patrick seems to manage contentment with no object at all, no hobby, no particular ambition, simply existing pleasantly, which I think Squidward finds almost more maddening than SpongeBob's enthusiasm, because there's nothing there to even argue with. You can mock someone for caring too much about bubbles. It's harder to mock someone for being simply unaccountably fine with everything, all the time, for no particular reason whatsoever. There's something in that distinction, actually, that connects back to the last man idea we touched on briefly earlier, though I don't want to lean on it too hard yet, since we'll get the proper version of that a bit further on tonight. Patrick's contentment without ambition is its own quiet little puzzle worth holding on to for later. Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche. Quick bit of background, because I think most people's relationship with this man is one slightly intense black and white photo of an enormous moustache and a handful of quotes that get printed on motivational posters in gyms, usually some version of "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," stripped of all the context that made it interesting in the first place. He was a German philosopher, writing mostly in the 1880s, and he died right at the very end of that century. And a fair amount of what gets attributed to him in popular culture is either oversimplified to the point of being wrong, or borrowed by people with genuinely unpleasant politics who twisted his actual writing into something he would have hated. That last bit happened largely after his death, through some unfortunate editing by family members. And it's a whole separate story I'm not getting into tonight, because it would take us well off course, and frankly, it's not cosy bedtime material. What I do want to get into is a small handful of his actual ideas, the ones that I think map onto SquidWard in a way that's almost uncanny once you see it. First one is what's usually called herd morality. The basic idea is dead simple once you strip the jargon off it. Groups of people, when they gather together, tend to pull each other towards sameness. Not through some sinister conspiracy, nothing that dramatic, just through the ordinary pull of belonging. It's comfortable to think the way the people around you think. It's comfortable to want what they want, dress how they dress, find the same things funny. Nietzsche thought this pull was incredibly powerful. Powerful enough to flatten genuinely interesting, genuinely individual people into something much blander, much safer, much more predictable, purely because going along with the group is so much easier than standing apart from it. Second one, and this is the one I think is doing the most work tonight, is what's usually translated as ressentiment. It's a French word Nietzsche borrowed because German didn't quite have one that fit what he meant. The short version is this: when someone has something you want and you genuinely cannot get it, there are basically two honest options. You can admit you want it and feel the discomfort of that. Or, and this is the much more common route apparently, you can quietly redefine the thing you can't have as bad, as beneath you, as not actually worth wanting in the first place, and redefine your own lack of it as a kind of virtue instead. It's not simple jealousy. Jealousy at least admits what it wants. Resentment dresses the wanting up as contempt, so thoroughly that the person doing it can properly convince themselves they never wanted the thing at all. Third, the last man. This one's almost a mirror image of resentment, and I think it's worth holding both at once. The last man is Nietzsche's name for a person, or really a whole kind of person, whose appetite for anything bigger than easy comfort has more or less switched itself off. Not evil, not cruel, just thoroughly, contentedly small. They've got their little pleasures, their routines, their gentle distractions, and they're perfectly happy. And Nietzsche thought that particular kind of happiness, the unreaching kind, the kind that stopped striving for anything at all, was actually one of the saddest outcomes a human life could land on, even though from the outside it looks like the easiest one. And then, just so there's something to contrast all that against, there's the famous one, the Übermensch, sometimes translated as the overman. This is the bit that gets the worst treatment in popular culture, usually flattened into some kind of dominate everyone around you power fantasy, which is more or less the opposite of what Nietzsche actually meant. His version was someone who'd worked out how to create their own values from scratch, rather than either resentfully reacting against other people's values, the ressentiment route, or comfortably absorbing the group's values without question, the last man route. It's not really about being powerful over other people at all. It's about building something really your own, out of a universe that doesn't hand you meaning for free. There's a particular flavour to the last man worth sitting with a little longer too, because I think it gets misread fairly often as simply meaning lazy or unambitious, and that's not quite it. The last man isn't necessarily unproductive. He might work hard, keep busy, fill his days properly. What defines him is the absence of any reaching beyond that, any genuine striving towards something he doesn't already comfortably have. He's found his small pleasures and stopped looking past them, and Nietzsche's image for the reaction of someone settling into that state was almost unbearably gentle for how damning he meant it. A small, contented blink. The kind of unthinking satisfaction you'd give something that asked nothing more of you than what you'd already got. Right, that's the toolkit. Herd morality, resentment, the last man, and the Übermensch sitting there as the road not taken. I'm not going to lecture you through any more definitions tonight, I promise. I just wanted them all on the table once, properly, so that later on, when I mention any of them again, you've already got the shape of it, and I don't have to stop and re-explain. Here's what I find quietly remarkable about all this, sitting here 140-odd years later. Nietzsche wasn't writing about cartoon characters, obviously. He was writing about an entire culture he watched losing its old religious certainties and scrambling to fill the gap with something, anything, that felt like meaning. But the actual mechanics he described, the way people manage the gap between what they want and what they've got, by either resenting the people who have it or by giving up wanting altogether, those mechanics don't really care. What century you're in, or whether you're human or, for that matter, an octopus who lives in a stone head. They're just patterns, and patterns show up wherever the right conditions are sitting around waiting for them. I think SquidWard Tentacles is sitting on exactly those conditions. He wants something he can't have, badly, every single day. He's surrounded by people who've got something close to it without even trying, and he spent years building an entire personality, an entire aesthetic, an entire sense of who he is, around managing that gap rather than closing it. Quick aside on Nietzsche himself, because I think it's worth knowing a little about the man behind all this, partly because it's interesting in its own right, and partly because there's a rather neat irony sitting in it I don't want to skip past. He was born in 1844 in a small town in what's now Germany, the son of a Lutheran pastor, and he spent a good chunk of his career as a university professor before chronic illness forced him out of that life, entirely while he was still relatively young. He wrote most of his major work in a fairly isolated, itinerant stretch of years after that, moving between boarding houses in Switzerland and Italy, largely unrecognised in his own lifetime, largely misunderstood by the small readership he did have, and he collapsed into a final decade of serious mental and physical decline before dying right at the end of the century, in 1900. I bring all that up because there's something quietly fitting about a man who spent so much of his actual life isolated and overlooked, being the one to write so precisely about the mechanics of wanting recognition you can't get. He wasn't observing resentment and the last man from some comfortable position of established success, looking down at lesser people. He was, by most accounts, scraping by on the margins of the very intellectual culture he was trying to address, largely ignored by the people he most wanted to read him. Make of that what you will. I find it rather moving, in a quietly melancholy way. One more idea worth having in the toolkit before we move on, since it'll come in useful later tonight. Nietzsche had a phrase, amor fati, which translates roughly as love of fate. The idea, in short, is about accepting the whole of your actual life, the good bits and the genuinely difficult bits both, rather than wishing your way into some cleaner, more flattering alternative version of events. Not resignation exactly, that's a different thing entirely, more a kind of active, willing embrace of everything that actually happened to you, on the grounds that it's the only life you've actually got, and constantly measuring it against some imaginary better version just guarantees you'll never feel properly settled in the one you're living. I'll come back to that right near the end of tonight, so just let it sit there quietly for now. It's worth saying, while we're here, that I'm deliberately skating past a great deal of Nietzsche's actual written work tonight. The proper philosophy, the truly difficult bits, the parts scholars spend entire careers arguing about the correct interpretation of. I'm not equipped for that, and it would make for a fairly miserable bedtime listen regardless. What I'm doing instead is borrowing the handful of ideas that map most cleanly onto a cartoon octopus, which is, I'll freely admit, a slightly cheeky way to use a serious philosopher, But I think the ideas hold up under that treatment rather better than you'd expect, which is sort of the whole reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Let's actually look at what SquidWard wants in concrete terms before we go any further into the why of it all. He wants to be an artist, properly, seriously, recognised. Not a hobbyist, not a Sunday painter, an actual celebrated artist, the kind people stop in the street to talk about. He plays the clarinet with real and genuine dedication, practicing for hours in that stone house, while his neighbours blow reef blowers about outside. He paints, he sculpts, he does interpretive dance with what I can only describe as total commitment. The kind of commitment you'd expect from someone who spent years convinced they're sitting on real, unrecognised talent. And here's the completely interesting bit, the bit I didn't fully appreciate until I went and actually dug into the specifics. The show is surprisingly careful, again and again, to suggest that SquidWard isn't actually talentless. One of the more thorough character write-ups I came across put it almost perfectly. His critical failure tends to come down to bad taste, rather than any real lack of ability. That's a genuinely different problem to have. Bad taste is fixable in theory. Bad taste just means you haven't worked out yet what's actually good. You've convinced yourself something is impressive when really it isn't, and you keep doubling down on the wrong instinct instead of the right one. His art, almost without exception, is about himself. Self-portrait after self-portrait, across what looks like every style going, abstract ones, surreal ones, the kind of thing you could absolutely picture hanging in a gallery somewhere if it were, say, anyone other than SquidWard holding the brush. In one fairly infamous episode, the googly artiste, he puts together a sculpture of himself for a visiting art critic, something he's clearly poured real effort into, and it's flatly rejected. Patrick, in the same episode, wins the critic over instead, with a rock that's got a pair of googly eyes stuck on it. Just a rock. Just two plastic eyes glued onto a rock he found lying about. I think that single contrast tells you almost everything about how this whole dynamic works for SquidWard. It's not that the world refuses to recognise effort, or refuses to recognise skill exactly. It's that the world, in Bikini Bottom at least, seems to consistently reward a kind of unself-conscious, almost accidental charm, the sort of thing you can't really study your way into, over SquidWard's painstaking, self-serious, hard-won craftsmanship. He's doing the work. He's doing rather earnest, dedicated work. And the universe keeps handing the prize to a rock with eyes on it instead, because the rock somehow has a quality SquidWard simply doesn't. There's another episode, Artist Unknown, where he's teaching an art class and SpongeBob, his actual pupil in the lesson, keeps producing what the show frames as thoroughly brilliant, intuitive work, almost by accident, while SquidWard, trying to demonstrate proper method, spirals slowly into something close to a breakdown. By the end, he's accidentally created an enormous, genuinely impressive statue, almost despite himself, in the middle of a full mental collapse. Even his one unambiguous artistic triumph in that episode arrives sideways, through chaos rather than through the careful, considered process he spent his whole life insisting is the correct way to make art. And then there's the detail that I think is the saddest single image in the entire show, and it's barely a joke at all. More of a quieter side. In an episode called One Crab's Trash, there's a brief shot of SquidWard visiting a small gravestone in his own front garden, one he's apparently put there himself, bringing it flowers like you would for an actual grave. The inscription reads simply, "Here lies SquidWard's hopes and dreams." That's it. No further explanation given, none needed. He has at some point off-screen formally and ceremonially buried his own ambitions and visits them with flowers, the way you'd visit a relative. There's a much older bit of show lore too, from an episode called Dunces and Dragons, set in a kind of medieval flashback, where it's revealed Squidward had an ancestor, a clarinet player just like him, who apparently cursed his own bloodline. If his descendants never learned to properly play the instrument, the curse was meant to follow them down 7 generations. It's played entirely as a joke, the sort of throwaway bit of lore this show does so well, but I find it quietly perfect anyway. Even in the show's own internal mythology, Squidward's failure to be recognised as a great artist isn't presented as random bad luck. It's practically ancestral. It's baked into the family line, generations deep, long before he was even born to inherit it. There's a couple of other episodes worth mentioning here too, because they all point at the same underlying thing from slightly different angles. In one called The Masterpiece, Squidward builds an enormous statue of Mr. Krabs, specifically to put a rival restaurant out of business, an oddly devious bit of motivation for him, and even that gets rejected in favour of the real Mr. Krabs simply turning up in person. Even when his art is technically successful enough to do the actual job he built it for, it still somehow loses out to the genuine article standing right next to it. There's another, Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost, where it's actually shown, fairly plainly, that he's capable of proper craftsmanship across a surprising range of mediums: wax sculpting, pottery painting, all of it competent, some of it really good by the standards the show itself sets. And it gets, more or less, no recognition whatsoever, the same as everything else he's ever made. I think that's worth dwelling on for a moment, because it rules out the simplest possible explanation for all this: the idea that Squidward's problem is purely self-delusion, that he's simply wrong about his own ability and the show's letting us in on the joke at his expense. It's more complicated than that, and more interesting too. He's got real skill, scattered across several disciplines, and it consistently fails to translate into the recognition he's after. Not because the skill isn't there, but because something else entirely, taste, timing, the particular subject matter he keeps choosing, keeps getting in the way. I think there's a version of this that's quietly relatable to anyone who's ever made something they were properly proud of and watched it land with a shrug. The skill being real doesn't guarantee the reception you are hoping for. Sometimes it's simply a mismatch between what you've made and what the room in front of you happens to want that particular day, and there's no amount of additional effort that reliably closes that gap. Squidward keeps trying to close it with more effort anyway, more practice, more self-portraits, more elaborate sculptures, on the assumption that the problem is quantity rather than something a bit harder to pin down. There's something worth noting too, in how often the show lets these art-focused episodes end on a small, quiet note of defeat, rather than a proper punchline. A lot of the comedy elsewhere in this show resolves cleanly. The chaos wraps up. Somebody learns a small lesson. The credits roll on a joke. The art episodes don't always do that. Squidward often just ends up back where he started, the statue rejected, the gallery unimpressed, no tidy moral attached, just a returning shrug, and the next ordinary day arriving regardless. I think that's a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. It would be easy enough to give him one clean artistic triumph and call the arc resolved. The show seems to understand, instead, that this particular kind of disappointment doesn't resolve cleanly in real life either, so it doesn't pretend to resolve it cleanly here. What he never quite tries, interestingly, across any of these episodes, is simply making something for somebody other than himself. Nearly all of it, the self-portraits especially, circles back round to his own image, his own talent, his own validation. I don't think that's incidental either. It rather fits the whole pattern we've been building tonight, art as evidence to be presented in his own defence, rather than art as something offered outward, for its own sake, to anyone else. Right, so back to that word from earlier, resentiment. I want to actually apply it properly now rather than just defining it in the abstract, because I think this is where the whole Squidward thing stops being a fun pattern matching exercise and starts feeling almost uncomfortably precise. Here's the mechanism again, slightly expanded. When you can't have something, and admitting that openly is too painful, one very human, very common move is to flip the value of the thing entirely. You don't say, I want that and I can't get it. You say, that thing is actually beneath me anyway. And crucially, you don't stop there, because half a flip doesn't do the job properly. You also need to redefine your own situation, your lack, your distance from the thing, as somehow superior instead. Not just I don't want that, but not wanting that or not having that makes me better than the people who do. Watch what Squidward actually does with SpongeBob's joy, with that lens on, and it lines up almost too neatly. He doesn't simply dislike SpongeBob's enthusiasm, he routinely frames it as evidence of stupidity, low, uncultured, beneath someone of Squidward's evident sophistication. SpongeBob blows bubbles, badly, by Squidward's account, and somehow this becomes proof of SpongeBob's lack of taste, rather than proof that SpongeBob is simply, effortlessly, having a nice time doing something that costs nothing and requires nobody's approval. Squidward needs SpongeBob's happiness to be lesser, because if it isn't lesser, if it's actually just happiness, plain and simple, unearned by any of the cultural credentials Squidward's spent years accumulating, then the whole architecture he's built around himself, the clarinet, the self-portraits, the carefully cultivated air of being the only adult in the room, starts to look less like sophistication and more like a very elaborate way of not having any fun. There's a phrase I came across in one of the more thorough character analyses I dug up while researching this, describing Squidward as having a real fondness for high art, while simultaneously holding an almost total disdain for actual creativity and imagination wherever he happens to encounter it. That's such a precise contradiction, isn't it? He loves the idea of art, the prestige of it, the cultivated taste of it, while actually failing to recognise or appreciate creativity itself when it's standing right in front of him, blowing a bubble or gluing eyes onto a rock. He's not against SpongeBob's imagination because it's bad. He's against it because it's working, effortlessly, in a way his own carefully studied technique never quite manages to. And I don't think that's a flaw in the writing, by the way, some accidental inconsistency the show never noticed. I think it's the entire joke, repeated episode after episode, in 100 small variations. Squidward isn't simply a snob who happens to be wrong about what's good. He's someone who has built an entire identity, an entire sense of moral and cultural superiority, specifically as a wall against admitting that he wants the thing he's mocking. The contempt isn't separate from the wanting. The contempt is what the wanting turned into once it had nowhere honest to go. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not really a cartoon-specific phenomenon at all, is it? Most of us have met a version of this in real life. The person who insists they never wanted the promotion anyway, the job's beneath them really, right around the time someone else gets it. The person who suddenly got a long, detailed list of reasons why the thing everyone else seems thrilled about is actually shallow or overrated or not worth the fuss, right around the time they realise they're not going to get to have it themselves. It's such a common move that we barely clock it as a move at all most of the time. It just sounds like having standards. That's rather the whole trick of it, I think. Resentment doesn't announce itself. It dresses up as taste, as maturity, as being above it all. And the disguise holds up so well that you can lose track yourself of what it was originally built to hide. What makes Squidward such a clean example, I think, rather than just a plausible one, is how consistently the show lets us see both halves at once. We get the contempt, loud and clear, episode after episode, but we also get, fairly regularly, these small unguarded glimpses of the actual want underneath it. The moment his face falls slightly, when nobody's praising his clarinet solo. The gravestone with the flowers on it that we talked about a little while ago. SpongeBob and Patrick never see that gap. As far as they're concerned, Squidward just doesn't like fun, full stop, simple as that, end of story. We, watching from outside, get to see both layers stacked on top of each other, the performance and the want it's covering for, which is exactly what makes him feel less like a cartoon joke and more like an actual person you might recognise. There's a lovely small example of this whole pattern that deserves a proper mention, because it shows the contempt and the want sitting right on top of each other within the space of a single episode. In one episode, Bubble Stand, SquidWard openly mocks SpongeBob's bubble blowing as something beneath serious consideration, a children's pastime, nothing to do with actual skill or craft. And yet later in that very same episode, once he's properly practiced SpongeBob's technique himself, in private, away from anyone watching, he ends up using it rather beautifully, turning what he dismissed as nonsense into something genuinely impressive, the moment nobody's around to see him admit where he learned it. There's an even sharper version of this tucked away in a different episode entirely, Sleepy Time, which is mostly about Squidward, Patrick and SpongeBob all wandering through each other's dreams. In Squidward's own dream, he's performing for a king, the exact recognition fantasy he's chasing throughout the entire show, and his clarinet breaks at the worst possible moment. His solution, inside his own subconscious, the one place you'd think his pride could organise things however it liked, is to use SpongeBob as a replacement instrument. It sounds dreadful, by any reasonable expectation. The crowd loves it anyway. I think that's almost too perfect a detail to be accidental. Even inside Squidward's own head, in a dream entirely of his own construction, the path to the recognition he's after runs directly through the very person he spends every waking hour dismissing as beneath him. He can't seem to imagine getting what he wants without SpongeBob somehow involved in the mechanism of it, even with total creative control over the fantasy and the option of writing him out entirely. Make of that what you will. I find it tells you a great deal about how thoroughly Squidward's sense of what he wants is tangled up with the very people his contempt is supposedly protecting him from. There's a small line of thinking I came across while researching this that captures the whole mechanism almost better than I could explain it myself. Given how thoroughly Squidward's shown losing across nearly every front the show puts him on, it's a fairly reasonable conclusion that his narcissism, the self-portraits, the insistence on his own refined taste, the constant air of being the only sophisticated creature in Bikini Bottom, isn't really arrogance in the simple sense at all. It's closer to scaffolding, something propped up specifically to give him a sense of worth he's not otherwise managing to get from the world actually agreeing with him about it. That distinction matters a fair bit, I think. Arrogance, properly defined, tends to come from people who've had their sense of superiority confirmed often enough that they've stopped questioning it. Squidward's version gets disproven constantly, episode after episode, by rocks with googly eyes and art critics who can't stand his sculptures, and a rival who beat him at the exact game he claims to care about most. And yet the scaffolding stays up regardless, gets repainted, gets reinforced, because taking it down would mean standing there with nothing between him and the actual verdict the world keeps quietly handing him. Now, if Squidward's contempt for SpongeBob is one shape of resentment, there's a second character who shows you a completely different shape of the exact same problem. And I think he's just as important, maybe more so, because he removes the easy excuse entirely. Squilliam Fancyson, Squidward's old rival from way back in high school band class. And the crucial thing about Squilliam, the thing that makes him such a sharp counterpoint, is that he's basically Squidward, design-wise, near enough identical, same species, same general shape, just dressed up a bit, robe, fancy unibrow, the works. He's not some other kind of creature entirely, off doing something Squidward could never have done. He's living, almost exactly, the life Squidward thinks he deserves. Wealthy, successful, genuinely accomplished as a musician, by all accounts the show gives us, with adoring crowds who actually mean it. That's what makes Squilliam dangerous, in story terms. With SpongeBob, Squidward can always retreat to the comfortable line that SpongeBob's happiness doesn't count. Because SpongeBob's an idiot, his joy is simple, uncultured, beneath consideration. That excuse simply doesn't work on Squilliam. Squilliam has impeccable, undeniable taste. Squilliam has talent the show never seriously questions. Squilliam has achieved exactly the kind of life SquidWard claims he's actually after. The recognition, the wealth, the audience that completely admires him rather than merely tolerating him. There's no comfortable, well, that doesn't really count available here. It very much counts. That's rather the entire problem. There's a detail from one of the later episodes, Squilliam Returns, that I think is one of the saddest small jokes in the whole show. Almost throwaway, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Squilliam casually mentions that back in their school days, Squidward was voted by their classmates as the one most likely to suck eggs. Not most likely to succeed, the way these superlatives usually go. The opposite, a formally recorded, peer-confirmed prediction of failure, voted on by an entire roomful of teenagers who apparently saw something coming that Squidward himself either didn't see or saw perfectly well, and has spent the rest of his life trying not to think about. And what does Squidward do with all of this, with a rival who's living proof the dream was achievable, just not by him? He doesn't quietly accept that maybe Squilliam's simply better at this than he is, doesn't shrug and move on with his life. He competes repeatedly, often disastrously, and when the competing fails, which it usually does, he falls back on exactly the same move we talked about a moment ago. He decides Squilliam's success doesn't really count either. Squilliam's shallow. Squilliam's a show-off. Squilliam's missing something, some deeper artistic soul Squidward's convinced he himself possesses, even as the evidence keeps quietly piling up the other way. I find Squilliam fascinating less as a character in his own right, and more as a kind of pressure test on the whole theory we've been building tonight. If resentment really were just Squidward being snobbish about people who are different from him, simpler than him, lesser somehow, then Squilliam should be the one exception. Squilliam isn't lesser. Squilliam isn't simple. Squilliam isn't the rock with googly eyes glued on, winning by some accident of unself-conscious charm. Squilliam did the actual work by every measure the show gives us, and won properly, fair and square, on Squidward's own terms. It's worth saying that Squilliam shows up again and again across the years. Never quite a fully developed character in his own right, more a recurring measuring stick, something the show wheels back out whenever it wants, to remind us exactly how far Squidward thinks. He's fallen short of where he ought to be. Squilliam's always got the bigger house, the more impressive crowd, the more obviously successful version of whatever Squidward's currently attempting. And every single time, Squidward's response follows roughly the same shape. A brief flash of genuine insecurity, quickly papered over with exactly the kind of dismissive contempt we spent the last section properly unpacking. If you want to tie this back to that bit of vocabulary from earlier, the Übermensch, the version of a person who's worked out how to build genuinely new values, rather than either resenting other people's or comfortably absorbing the group's. Squilliam isn't quite that either, to be fair to Squidward. Squilliam's success looks a great deal like simply winning at the exact same game Squidward's already playing, just better resourced and rather more naturally gifted at it. There's nothing especially self-created about Squilliam's values. He wants what Squidward wants, more or less: recognition, wealth, an adoring audience. He's simply better positioned to get it. So if anything, Squilliam's less a model of Nietzsche's Overman and more proof that the entire game Squidward's playing, the cultured, recognised artist game, was never really about building something thoroughly new in the first place. It's the same scoreboard, with Squilliam simply further ahead on it. I think that's actually the bleaker reading of the two of them, when you sit with it properly. Squidward's not failing at something noble and being beaten by something cynical. He's failing at the exact same fairly conventional ambitions Squilliam's succeeding at: recognition, status, applause, And the gap between them isn't really about depth of soul or purity of artistic intention at all. Whatever SquidWard tells himself about it on his worst days, it's mostly talent, timing, and a fair bit of luck, distributed unevenly between two creatures who, underneath the robe and the unibrow, want almost exactly the same thing. There's something almost generous, in a strange way, about how the show keeps bringing Squilliam back, rather than letting SquidWard simply forget about him. It would be easier, narratively, to let that particular wound stay buried. Instead, it gets reopened periodically. A phone call here, a chance encounter there, almost as if the show itself understands that the rivalries we never properly resolve are exactly the ones that keep quietly shaping us, long after we'd rather have moved past them. It's worth pointing out where all this actually started too, because I think the origin is almost as telling as the rivalry itself. The two of them met in band class back in school, which means the entire shape of Squidward's adult unhappiness traces back to the exact same environment where he first started building his identity around being musically gifted in the first place. Squilliam isn't an external threat that arrived later in life to spoil something that was otherwise fine. He was there from the very beginning, present at the actual formation of Squidward's sense of himself as an artist, which I think explains why the rivalries never properly faded the way most school grudges eventually do. It's not really a grudge about a person, it's a grudge about the moment Squidward first decided what kind of life he wanted, with Squilliam standing right there as both witness and eventually proof that it was achievable, just not by him. Right, I want to slow right down and properly sit with one particular episode here, because it's the one moment in this whole show where everything we've been talking about gets turned briefly inside out, and I think it deserves its own space before we get back into the heavier stuff. It's just one more room in the house, same as all the others, except this particular room happens to have a bit more warmth in it than most of the ones we've walked through so far tonight. There's a single freeze frame near the end of this one, Squidward mid-leap, baton already thrown away, both arms up, that I think might be the happiest single image of him in the entire run of the show. I want to spend a bit of time working out how he actually gets there, because the route's a good deal more roundabout than you'd expect. It begins, as it happens, with Squilliam. Of course it does. He rings Squidward up, smug as ever, to inform him that he's the leader of a band scheduled to play a prestigious halftime show at something called the Bubble Bowl, a fairly obvious parody of the actual Super Bowl, but that he's unable to make the performance himself, and would Squidward perhaps like to step in? It's framed as generosity, but it's plainly, transparently, a setup designed to humiliate him, because Squilliam knows perfectly well Squidward doesn't actually have a band. And rather than admit that, rather than simply decline, Squidward does the one thing his pride apparently never lets him do. He lies, confidently, on the spot, claims he absolutely does have a band, and accepts. Then spends the rest of the episode scrambling to assemble one out of whoever in Bikini Bottom will answer his recruitment flyer, which, brilliant little detail this, openly advertises the chance to be forever adored by thousands of people you don't know, which I think tells you rather a lot about what Squidward properly believes. The appeal of all this is meant to be. What follows across the next several days of rehearsal is, frankly, an absolute disaster, repeatedly and creatively so. Squidward gets pinned to a wall by drumsticks his bandmates have mistaken for mouth instruments. Two flag twirlers, in a bit so cartoonishly tragic, it loops back round to funny, spin their flags hard enough to launch themselves into a passing blimp. Plankton collapses from exhaustion, attempting a harmonica solo on an instrument far too large for him. By the final day of practice, after Squidward tries having everyone play as loud as they possibly can, which goes about as well as you'd expect, the whole rehearsal dissolves into a full-scale brawl that wrecks most of the instruments entirely. And here Squidward does something genuinely consistent with everything we've covered tonight. He gives up, properly, completely walks out on his own band the night before the performance, telling them flatly he's cancelling the whole thing, because none of them have improved at all, and none of them, in his view, have taken his dreams seriously enough to deserve carrying it forward. What happens next is the part that actually gets me every single time I watch it. The townspeople, the very same people Squidward's just walked out on in obvious disgust, decide on their own, without him there to organise or inspire or even ask them to show up anyway. They turn up at the Bubble Bowl in full uniform, instruments in hand, ready to play, and effectively force Squidward, who's already prepared a cover story about a tragic marching accident to avoid showing his face, into actually going through with it. He conducts the performance absolutely convinced it's about to be a humiliating disaster, bracing for it the entire walkout. And instead, the band, this same ragtag group that couldn't get through 4 days of rehearsal without somebody getting launched into a blimp, performs an entire song, a genuine, full-throated rock number called Sweet Victory, beautifully, in front of a packed stadium of cheering fans. Squilliam, watching from the crowd, fully expecting to witness his rival's public collapse, ends up so shocked by the actual quality of the performance that he faints clean away. I think the detail that matters most here, the one that ties this whole evening together for me, is that this triumph doesn't happen because Squidward finally proves he's the brilliant solo artist he's always insisted he secretly is. It happens because the people he spent the entire show holding in quiet contempt, the very same neighbours whose joy he spent years redefining as stupid, as lesser, as beneath him, show up for him anyway, entirely on their own initiative, with no expectation of thanks and no real obligation to do so at all. The win isn't solitary genius vindicated, it's community freely given to someone who's done very little to obviously earn it beyond simply needing it. And Squidward's reaction, in the moment itself, isn't smugness, isn't the kind of vindicated superiority you might expect from a character who spent the whole show insisting he was better than everyone around him all along. It's pure, uncomplicated, actually startled joy. He throws his conductor's baton away and leaps into the air, properly delighted, with absolutely none of the usual guardedness, none of the contempt, none of the carefully maintained distance he keeps from everyone else around him for the rest of the show. For about 30 seconds of screen time, the wall comes all the way down, and what's underneath it turns out to be exactly what you'd expect. Somebody who just wanted, very badly, to be good at something, in front of people who actually cared whether he was. There's a particular irony worth flagging too, in how the whole thing gets started in the first place. Squidward doesn't form this band because he truly wants to share music with people, or because he's looking for an excuse to spend more time with his neighbours. He forms it purely out of pride, to avoid the humiliation of admitting to Squilliam that he doesn't actually have one. The motive's entirely defensive, entirely about managing how he looks in his rival's eyes, right up until the actual performance, where something he didn't plan for and didn't particularly want happens anyway. Real connection, earned through the genuinely undignified process of failing repeatedly in front of people and having them show up regardless. The lie he told to protect his pride ends up accidentally manufacturing the one moment of real joy the show ever properly gives him. I don't think that's a coincidence either, the way it's built. It rather suggests that the things we construct purely out of fear of looking bad sometimes accidentally stumble into something genuine anyway, provided we don't manage to sabotage them completely before anyone else gets the chance to turn up and help. I don't think this episode undoes anything we've talked about tonight, by the way, and I don't think it's meant to. Squidward goes right back to being Squidward in the very next episode, contemptuous, snobbish, irritated by his neighbours all over again, the whole pattern resetting itself exactly as it always does on this kind of show. But for one afternoon, the gap between what he wants and what he's got closes completely, and crucially, It closes through exactly the kind of communal, undignified, slightly chaotic effort he spent the entire show insisting was beneath him. Not through solitary genius, not through cultivated taste, finally being properly recognised. Through a sponge, a starfish, a crab, a squirrel, and a tiny furious plankton, all turning up anyway, instruments in hand, for someone who never even asked them to. It's probably worth saying that this isn't just my own reading of the episode either. It's consistently turned up across various fan polls and critical rankings over the years as one of the most fondly remembered episodes the show's ever produced, often cited specifically for that final stretch, the moment everything comes together against all expectation. I think that's worth noting because it suggests I'm not simply projecting a tidy bit of philosophy onto a cartoon that never intended to carry it. A lot of people, watching with no Nietzsche in mind whatsoever, land on this exact scene as the one that sticks with them most, which tells you something about how well the underlying emotional logic of it works, completely independent of any of the framework I've been laying over the top of it tonight. I think part of why it lands so universally is that everyone's had some version of the disastrous rehearsal, the project that falls apart days before it's due, the moment you're convinced you're about to embarrass yourself in front of the one person you most wanted to impress. Not everyone gets the version where the people you'd quietly written off as unreliable show up anyway and somehow pull it together. But the people who have experienced something like that, even once, tend to recognise it instantly in Squidward's face during that performance, the particular flavour of shock that comes from being helped by people you'd already stopped expecting anything from. Right, this next one is the big one for me. The episode I think proves the herd morality side of all this better than anything else in the entire show. And I want to properly walk through the whole shape of it before I start pulling it apart, because if you haven't seen it in a while, or ever, the details matter. A new toy is to blame for how it all kicks off, as is so often the way in this show. SpongeBob and Patrick get hold of a pair of reef blowers, those big handheld things that suck and blow air, and naturally, they decide the best possible use for them is each other's houses. They work their way through Patrick's rock and SpongeBob's pineapple, having a grand old time, and then, inevitably, they get to Squidward's. They suck the windows clean out of his Moai house, they suck the door off its hinges. Squidward, trapped inside with no way out, ends up having to dig his own tunnel through the floor just to get free, and by the time he surfaces, his entire house collapses around him, reduced to rubble, while the two of them carry on, blissfully unaware they've just destroyed his home. And this is, fully, the final straw for him. He says, and this line always gets me slightly, even on a rewatch, that he'd rather rip out his own brainstem and skip rope with it in the middle of a busy intersection than keep living where he currently does, which is, even by this show's standards, a remarkably specific and grim image for a children's cartoon, and I think that's rather the point. The writers wanted you to feel just how done he is. And then, almost as if summoned by the sheer force of his despair, his television, lying in the wreckage of his own house, switches itself on. An advert plays for a place called Tentacle Acres, a private, gated community built exclusively for squids, for people, in other words, exactly like him. The advertisement promises happiness, and I rather love the actual line they use for it, because it's such a perfect little artifact of advertising language. Happiness is just a suction cup away. Squidward doesn't even finish watching the advert properly before he's packed his things and is heading for the gate. Once he arrives, the guard on the intercom asks him a couple of screening questions, essentially confirming he isn't a sponge, isn't a starfish, and the gate swings open onto rows and rows of houses, identical to his own, stretching off into the distance. And he is, genuinely, completely delighted. Everyone there looks like him. Everyone there sounds like him. There's an entire community organised around clarinet, around interpretive dance, around exactly the things Squidward's always claimed mattered most to him. He even gets a small thrill out of finding canned bread at the local shop, which on its own tells you a great deal about how starved he's been for the simple comfort of things going exactly the way he expects them to. His first few days there are shown almost entirely as a kind of montage of contentment. He bikes with his neighbours, all biking in identical formation. He shops for groceries alongside people buying exactly what he's buying. He joins an interpretive dance class full of squids dancing in exactly his style. He finds a clarinet trio practicing in the park and turns it into a quartet, slotting in seamlessly. Nobody missing a beat, because of course they don't. They're all effectively him. And then, slowly, over the course of the next few days, something starts to shift, and the show handles this part with real subtlety for what's ostensibly a goofy kids' cartoon. The exact same routine, repeated day after day, the biking, the canned bread, the dance class, the clarinet quartet, stops feeling like paradise and starts feeling like a loop he can't quite get out of. His smile in these later scenes gets a bit thinner each time. There's nothing wrong technically, everyone's still pleasant, everything's still exactly as advertised, but there's nothing surprising left in any of it either, because nobody around him is different enough from him to surprise him with anything. By the time he finally admits to himself, sitting alone on a park bench, that something about this supposed dream life has gone hollow, he hears a familiar sound in the distance, a reef blower, and for one brief, properly poignant moment, he thinks it might be SpongeBob. It isn't. It's just a park worker going about an entirely unremarkable bit of maintenance, but the fact that Squidward's first instinct, hearing that specific sound, is a flicker of hope rather than dread, tells you everything about where his head's actually landed by this point. What follows is more or less inevitable once you know Squidward at all. He picks up the abandoned reef blower himself and starts causing exactly the kind of chaos he spent the entire opening of the episode being furious about. Sucking up groceries, interrupting croquet games, generally making a nuisance of himself in precisely the manner SpongeBob and Patrick used to make a nuisance of themselves on him. His perfectly identical neighbours, predictably, are not amused and form an organised, distinctly orderly angry mob to deal with him, complete, brilliantly, with what's described as a properly drawn up, formally itemised list of grievances, because of course even their outrage comes neatly typed and filed. And here's the detail that I think makes the whole thing land. When SpongeBob and Patrick finally make it through the gate to apologise and bring him home, they really cannot find him in the crowd. Every single resident of Tentacle Acres looks close enough to identical that Squidward, the actual individual man they've come to rescue, is completely indistinguishable from the angry community chasing him. He gets away in the end by strapping the reef blower to himself and essentially rocketing out over the wall, laughing in a slightly unhinged way as he flies off, and SpongeBob, watching him go, simply turns to Patrick and says, "Well, we know one thing, it certainly isn't that guy. The two people who supposedly know him best in the world can't even pick him out of a crowd of people who, on paper, are exactly his type." I don't think I need to spell out the Nietzsche connection too heavily here, given everything we covered earlier, but I do want to draw a couple of lines properly, because I think the precision of it is genuinely worth appreciating rather than just gesturing at. Tentacle Acres is herd morality made literal, made architectural even, gates and all. It's a community built entirely around sameness, where the comfort of belonging has been turned into the actual founding principle of the place, advertised openly as the product on sale. And what the episode shows you with real clarity for something this silly on the surface is that total sameness isn't peace. It's a kind of slow suffocation. Squidward doesn't get bored at Tentacle Acres because something's gone wrong with the place. He gets bored because nothing can ever go right or wrong there in any way that matters, because nothing there is different enough from him to actually surprise him. There's a line of thinking I came across while reading about this particular episode that stuck with me. The idea that Tentacle Acres functions almost like a mirror Squidward's been handed, and what he discovers, looking into it, is that the thing he thought he wanted most, total acceptance, total similarity, a world with no SpongeBob and no Patrick anywhere in it, turns out to be its own particular kind of loneliness, just dressed up in a much friendlier outfit than the usual sort. He went looking for belonging and found a kind of erasure instead. Everyone's so alike that nobody, including him, stands out enough to actually be seen. There's one more piece of this particular episode worth flagging, because it's easy to miss on a casual watch. When the angry mob finally corners him near the end, and SpongeBob and Patrick arrive at almost exactly the same moment. What saves him isn't his own quick thinking, it's pure chaos. A reef blower strapped on at the last second, launching him clean over the wall and away from the whole situation entirely. He doesn't resolve the conflict, he escapes it, laughing in this slightly unhinged, delighted way as he flies off. And there's something rather telling in that too. Faced with two different versions of the exact same underlying problem, smothering sameness on one side, smothering chaos on the other, Squidward's actual instinct in the moment is neither order nor disorder properly chosen. It's just movement, away from whichever one happens to be closing in on him. I think about that a fair bit in relation to my own life, if I'm honest. The number of times I've truly convinced myself that some particular change of scenery, new job, new city, new routine, would finally sort out whatever the underlying discomfort happened to be, only to discover a few months in that the discomfort had simply repacked its bags and come along for the move. Tentacle Acres isn't really a story about squids when you boil it down properly. It's a story about how comfort, chased hard enough and achieved completely enough, tends to reveal itself as a different kind of problem rather than the solution it was advertised as. Squidward didn't fail to find happiness there because the place was somehow flawed. The place worked exactly as advertised. That was rather the issue. There's a detail right at the start of his arrival worth pulling out properly too, the actual screening process at the gate, because I think it's funnier and a bit more pointed than it first appears. Before he's let in, the guard on the intercom runs through a short series of questions, confirming, essentially, that he isn't a sponge, isn't a starfish, is simply a regular, ordinary, peace-loving sort. It's gatekeeping, quite literally, dressed up as a polite formality, and it's worth noticing that this is the exact same logic that locks SpongeBob and Patrick out later in the episode, when they turn up to apologise, and the guards flatly tell them their kind isn't welcome here. The community Squidward's been longing for, it turns out, runs on precisely the same mechanism of exclusion he spent his life being irritated by from the outside, just finally working in his favour for once, which I think is exactly why it feels so good to him on arrival, and exactly why it curdles so completely once he's properly inside it. There's also a small, almost throwaway moment just after he gets through the gate, where he bumps into another resident on the street, and the two of them immediately, instinctively, trade a round of insults, the way he and his old neighbours might have done back home. I find that detail rather telling, even this early in the episode. He's arrived somewhere built entirely around eliminating friction, and within minutes he's already generating a small dose of it anyway, almost on reflex, as if some part of him needs at least a little of that texture to feel properly oriented in a place. Right, slightly different angle now, but I think it sits naturally alongside everything we've just covered. Let's talk about the Krusty Krab. Squidward works the till there, has done for the entire run of the show, decades of fictional time at this point, ringing up Krabby Patties for an employer who is, by any reasonable measure, one of the more comically tight-fisted bosses in children's television, and alongside a co-worker whose relentless enthusiasm for the job completely seems to make Squidward's daily life worse, because nothing highlights how much you hate something, quite like watching someone else love it without effort, right beside you, every single shift. He hates this job. That's not subtext, the show states it plainly and often, and yet, episode after episode, season after season, he's still there. Still behind that till, still groaning audibly every time the bell over the door rings and another customer walks in wanting a Krabby Patty. He has absolutely no interest in serving them. There's one episode worth mentioning specifically here where he actually does quit, properly, dramatically, walks straight out of the Krusty Krab and into what he presumably imagines will be a far more dignified existence pursuing his art full time. It does not go well for him. He ends up, in fairly short order, homeless, and there's a small, almost throwaway line in that episode where he mentions that nobody would buy his paintings, so eventually he had to eat them, just to get by, which is one of those jokes that's clearly meant to land as absurd slapstick, and does on first viewing, and then sits with you slightly uncomfortably afterward, once you think about it properly. The dream, unsupported by any actual income or structure, doesn't transform into the glamorous artistic life he'd imagined. It collapses almost immediately into bare survival, and he's literally consuming the only proof he's got that he ever tried. I think there's something genuinely worth sitting with in the fact that the job, miserable as it plainly makes him, is also the thing keeping him fed, housed, and at least nominally connected to a community, however much he complains about that community on a daily basis. The Krusty Krab is comfortable in exactly the way Tentacle Acres was comfortable, just dressed in a far less appealing outfit. It's known, it's predictable, it's a routine he can complain about endlessly without ever actually having to risk anything by leaving it for good. There's another episode worth a quick mention here too, Selling Out, where the Krusty Krab briefly gets bought up and turned into a chain restaurant, Krabby-O Mondays, and the staff are required, under threat of a visit from something ominously referred to as human resources, to maintain a constant, performed cheerfulness regardless of how they're actually feeling. I won't dwell on it for long, it's not really SquidWard's story specifically in that episode, but I think it's worth flagging as a kind of dark little echo of everything we've been talking about tonight. Manufactured contentment, enforced from outside, standing in for the real thing, because the real thing is inconvenient for whoever's in charge. What I keep landing on, with the Krusty Krab specifically, is how thoroughly it represents the opposite move to Tentacle Acres, while somehow arriving at a similar destination. Tentacle Acres was SquidWard actively chasing comfort, deliberately walking towards sameness, because he thought it was what he wanted. The Krusty Krab is comfort that simply happened to him, a job he presumably took at some point for reasons the show's never bothered to explain, that calcified into routine before he noticed it happening, and that he's now too embedded in to easily walk away from, even though he clearly vocally daily wants to. There's a comparison worth making here too between SquidWard and his employer, because I think it sharpens the picture a little. Mr. Krabs isn't keeping SquidWard at that till out of any particular malice, he's simply running a business as cheaply as he possibly can, and SquidWard happens to be reliable labour he's never had a reason to properly reconsider. There's nothing personal in it from Krabs' side, which somehow makes it worse rather than better. SquidWard's not trapped by a villain, he's trapped by ordinary, unremarkable economic gravity, the kind that doesn't require anyone to be cruel, just for nobody involved to have a particular reason to change anything. I think that's a fairly honest bit of observation about a lot of real jobs too. Most of us aren't kept in place by dramatic villainy. We're kept in place by the much quieter, much harder to argue with logic of rent being due, of routines being easier to maintain than dismantle, of the genuine uncertainty of whatever the alternative might actually look like once you got there. SquidWard's tried the alternative once properly, and it ended with him eating his own paintings. You don't need a philosophy degree to understand why he hasn't tried it again with any real conviction since. What I find almost sweet about it, in a slightly grim way, is that he never stops complaining either. He doesn't settle into quiet, resigned acceptance of the job the way you might expect after enough years of it. He's still audibly furious about it, decades in, which I think is actually a small stubborn act of refusal in its own right. He hasn't talked himself into liking it. He hasn't built the same elaborate contempt-based defense around the Krusty Krab that he's built around SpongeBob's happiness. He just hates it, openly, consistently, without ever quite managing to do anything about it. There's something almost honest in that particular failure, compared with everything else we've covered tonight. It's the one place in the whole show, actually, where SquidWard doesn't bother dressing the unhappiness up as taste or standards or superiority. He just says it plainly. No elaborate justification required, no redefinition of the till as somehow beneath him in some grand cultural sense. Just a tired, ordinary, completely undisguised dislike of where he spends most of his waking hours, which, compared with the carefully managed contempt he reserves for his neighbours, looks almost refreshing by comparison. There's another episode worth a quick mention here, Selling Out, where the Krusty Krab briefly gets bought up and turned into a chain restaurant, rebranded with a chirpy corporate name, and the staff are required, under threat of a visit from something ominously referred to only as human resources, to maintain a constant, performed cheerfulness, regardless of how they're actually feeling underneath it. I won't dwell on it for long. It's not really SquidWard's story specifically, in that particular episode, but I think it's worth flagging as a dark little echo of everything we've been talking about tonight. Manufactured contentment, enforced from outside, standing in for the real thing, because the real thing happens to be inconvenient for whoever's currently in charge. It's herd morality with a corporate logo stapled to it, essentially. The same comfortable sameness Tentacle Acres sold him voluntarily, except this time nobody's pretending it's a choice. Right, this next one's a slightly later episode than most of what we've covered so far, and I think it's doing something rather different to the others, so I want to give it proper room. An accident kicks the whole thing off. SpongeBob, in the middle of some unrelated bit of nonsense, slams a door directly into SquidWard's face. Hard enough that he ends up in hospital. Hard enough that he needs actual reconstructive surgery to fix the damage. And when the bandages finally come off, after a fairly drawn-out, comedic stretch of SpongeBob being unbearable in the waiting room, the result isn't what anyone expected. SquidWard isn't simply back to normal. He's handsome. Genuinely, dramatically handsome, in a way the show plays completely straight, with the nurse practically melting on the spot, with strangers gasping in the street. And what follows is, on the surface, exactly the fantasy SquidWard spent the entire show insisting he deserves. Recognition, adoration, people stopping him constantly, just to look at him, to compliment him, to ask for an autograph. He gets a limousine. Crowds gather outside his house, chanting his praises long into the night. For one brief, thoroughly lovely stretch of episode, SquidWard Tentacles, of all people, is the single most desired figure in Bikini Bottom. And it's worth pointing out, this isn't really about talent or taste or culture at all. The things he's always insisted mattered. It's just his face, a pure, simple accident of appearance, with absolutely none of the years of practice or self-portraits or carefully cultivated standards behind it, and it curdles astonishingly fast. Within about a day, the attention stops feeling like recognition and starts feeling like a siege. Strangers reach through his window while he's trying to have a quiet bath. People start taking his belongings, his shirt, his clarinet, simply because they're his and they want a piece of him. He can't walk anywhere without being swarmed. The privacy he presumably always had, even as the ignored, overlooked octopus next door, evaporates completely. And what replaces it isn't the dignified, respected, artistic life he'd always imagined for himself. It's something closer to being hunted, politely, by an entire town that stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him purely as an object worth being near. By the time he finally turns to SpongeBob for help, genuinely panicked, really desperate, he's not asking for more attention. He's begging to be made ordinary again. He wants his old face back, his old, anonymous, overlooked, complained about life back, and the show stages the actual reversal as this almost absurd bit of slapstick, SpongeBob repeatedly slamming the same door into his face, trying to recreate the accident in reverse, except it keeps backfiring and making him even more handsome instead, the crowd growing more frenzied with every slam, until finally, almost by sheer accident, a falling shoe knocks him into a support beam and his original face returns. And the crowd, instantly, without a flicker of sentiment, loses all interest and disperses. There's a small, quietly brutal coda to the episode that I think is worth mentioning properly, because it tells you everything about how the show actually feels about the whole arrangement. Mr. Krabs, who'd been charging people for the privilege of touching Squidward's handsome face while the fame lasted, is left standing alone afterward, slamming the door against Squidward's perfectly ordinary face over and over, begging the departed crowd to come back. Convinced, against all visible evidence, that he can recreate the magic through sheer repetition and a bit of elbow grease, the crowd's gone, the fame's gone, and what's left is just Squidward, his actual face restored, and one very confused crab still slamming a door, apparently unable to accept that whatever that was, it's over now. I think what makes this episode so interesting, sitting where it does in everything we've covered tonight, is that it's the one time the show actually hands Squidward the exact thing his contempt for everyone else has always implied he's owed. Not earned recognition through years of dedicated practice, but pure, total, unearned adoration. More of it than he could possibly have imagined wanting, and it turns out almost instantly to be completely hollow. Worse than hollow, actually, actively unbearable, a kind of constant, suffocating attention with nothing real underneath it, nobody actually interested in him, just in the surface they're currently allowed to look at. There's a way of reading this that connects rather neatly to something Nietzsche wrote about. The idea that what we think we want, sitting on the outside looking in, often turns out to be a kind of costume rather than an actual solution, something we can put on and parade around in for a while, before discovering it was never going to fix the underlying problem at all, because the underlying problem was never really about the costume in the first place. Squidward didn't actually want to be looked at. He wanted to be recognised, properly, for something real. His playing, his eye, his actual taste, assuming any of that was ever as good as he's convinced himself it is. Being looked at, it turns out, without any of that underneath it, is just exposure. It's not the same thing at all, and the show, to its real credit, lets him discover that distinction the hard way in front of an entire town, and then quietly lets him choose, given the option to go back to being himself rather than keep the mask on. I don't think that's a small detail either, by the way, that he chooses it. Nobody forces Squidward back to his old face. He actively begs for it, the moment the cost of the alternative becomes clear. Given a straight choice between being adored for something hollow and being overlooked as something true, he picks the truth, almost immediately, with no real hesitation, once the panic sets in. That's not nothing. That's arguably the single clearest, most decisive choice Squidward makes in the entire run of the show, and it happens in an episode that's mostly remembered, fairly enough, for a deeply silly meme of his exaggerated handsome face, rather than for what it's actually quietly arguing underneath all that. Funny how often that goes, the actually thoughtful bit hiding directly behind the bit everyone screenshots. There's a small detail in the middle of all this that I think deserves its own mention because it's such a perfect bit of supporting commentary on the whole episode. While the fame's still in full swing, Mr. Krabs, ever the opportunist, starts charging the gathered crowd a small fee just for the privilege of touching Squidward's new face, treating the whole spectacle as a business opportunity rather than anything resembling concern for his employees' obvious distress. It's a properly funny bit of slapstick on its own terms, but it also quietly underlines exactly what's wrong with the adoration Squidward's receiving. It was never really about him as a person to begin with. It's a product being sold by someone else to a crowd that's paying for proximity to a surface rather than any kind of genuine connection, and Squidward, stuck in the middle of his own transaction, doesn't get a cut of it, doesn't get a say in it, doesn't even get asked. It's worth a quick mention, while we're here, that this particular episode has had a rather strange afterlife of its own, well beyond the show itself. The exaggerated, oddly unsettling version of his handsome face toward the end has become one of the most recognisable single images associated with the entire franchise, endlessly reused, endlessly remixed, turning up in places that have nothing whatsoever to do with the actual plot it came from. There's a small irony sitting in that, I think, that the episode's lasting cultural footprint ended up being almost entirely about the surface, the face itself, completely detached from the rather more thoughtful thing the episode was quietly doing underneath it, which is, in its own roundabout way, exactly the trap the episode was warning Squidward about in the first place: attention paid to the appearance, with the substance underneath it largely forgotten. I don't say that as a criticism of anyone who's ever used the image for a laugh online. It is a genuinely funny face, and I've certainly used it myself once or twice. I just think it's a nice little accidental bit of proof for everything the episode's actually about, sitting right there in how the internet chose to remember it. So I want to use this last proper section to pull back a bit, away from individual episodes, and just sit with why any of this matters to me, beyond the fairly satisfying puzzle piece click of watching a children's cartoon line up with a 19th century philosopher. Squidward's reputation, if you go looking around at how people actually talk about him, has shifted a fair bit over the years. He started out, I think, mostly as the comic foil, the straight man, whose whole function was reacting badly to SpongeBob and Patrick's nonsense, so the audience had someone to laugh along with, rather than just laughing at. But somewhere along the way, and I don't think this was planned by anyone particularly, he became something else to a lot of grown adults rewatching the show. He became the character people recognise themselves in. There's a particular kind of comment you see again and again from adult viewers, people saying Squidward's the one they actually relate to now. More than SpongeBob, more than Patrick, sometimes slightly sheepishly, like admitting it says something a bit unflattering about how their life turned out. I don't think it does, for what it's worth. I think it just says something true about adulthood generally, the fact that most of us, at some point, end up doing a job that isn't quite the dream, living somewhere we didn't entirely choose, surrounded by people we're fond of in theory and occasionally can't stand in practice, holding on to some hobby or ambition from years ago that we keep meaning to take more seriously and somehow never quite do. Squidward's not a cautionary tale dressed up as comic relief. He's just what it looks like when all of that gets exaggerated slightly, turned up a notch or two for the sake of a joke, and then left running consistently across several hundred episodes, so you've got plenty of time to actually notice the pattern in it. What I find myself coming back to, after spending this much time properly thinking it all through, is that Squidward's problem was never really a lack of ability, and I don't think it was even really a lack of opportunity either. Not entirely. Plenty of doors do open for him across the show. The marching band, the brief stretch of fame, various small triumphs scattered throughout. What seems to actually trip him up, again and again, is the particular way he's chosen to manage the gap between where he is and where he wants to be. Rather than simply admitting the want, sitting with the discomfort of it properly, he keeps reaching for contempt instead, Because contempt, in the moment, feels a good deal better than longing does. It's quicker, it's tidier, it lets you walk away from the conversation, feeling superior rather than exposed. The trouble, and I think this is the actual warning buried in all of it, the bit Nietzsche was pointing at well over a century before any of this existed, is that contempt doesn't actually close the gap. It just covers it over, temporarily and rather effectively, right up until something forces you to look at it directly again. A rival who's completely better than you. A moment of unearned attention that turns out hollow. A community of identical neighbours who reveal that sameness was never actually what you wanted in the first place. The gap's still sitting there underneath. The entire time, patiently waiting, regardless of how thoroughly you've convinced yourself otherwise in the meantime. I think that's why the handful of episodes where SquidWard actually gets something real, the marching band performance especially, land as hard as they do, harder, frankly, than I expected, when I sat down to actually plan all this out properly. They're rare, they're brief, he doesn't get to keep them, but for a few minutes here and there, scattered across this absurdly long-running cartoon about a sponge who works at a burger restaurant, the show lets its grumpiest, most offended character feel something completely unguarded, and it's never contempt in those moments. It's always something closer to relief. There's a quote I mentioned earlier from Tom Kenny, the bit about SquidWard being jealous of a capacity for joy he can't quite access himself. And I think that's actually the kindest possible reading of this whole character. Kinder than the show itself usually bothers to spell out directly. He's not written as someone who simply doesn't value happiness. He's written as someone who wants it desperately and has built an entire elaborate, exhausting structure of taste and standards and superiority specifically to avoid admitting how much he wants it, because admitting it, properly, out loud, would mean sitting with just how far away from it he's let himself drift. I don't think there's a tidy lesson to take from any of this, by the way, and I'd be slightly suspicious of myself if I tried to hand you one at this point in the evening. SquidWard doesn't get fixed. The show doesn't want him fixed, not really. A contented, self-actualized SquidWard would frankly be a much less interesting character, and probably a much less honest one too. He stays exactly as he is, episode after episode, year after year, decade after decade at this point. Still snobbish, still resentful, still occasionally, unpredictably, capable of real joy when the circumstances catch him properly off guard. I think that's actually closer to how most of us function as well. If I'm being completely honest about it, we don't resolve our particular version of this. We just live alongside it, manage it as best we can, and every so often, if we're lucky, something happens that briefly cracks the contempt open and lets the actual want underneath it breathe a little. What strikes me most, sitting here at the end of working through all this properly, is how gentle the show ultimately is with him, despite how relentlessly it mocks him on the surface, episode after episode. It never lets him win permanently. It never lets him keep the adoration, or the talent properly recognised, or the community that shows up for him without being asked. But it does, consistently, let us see underneath the contempt, often enough that we know, by now, it's not the whole story. We know about the gravestone with the flowers on it. We know about the reef blower he mistook for SpongeBob, sitting there hoping it was him. We know what his face looked like, properly, fully, for those few seconds after the band finished playing. I think that's a kind of respect actually buried in there, underneath all the slapstick and the door slamming and the jokes about his nose. The show could have made him purely comic, purely a punching bag, never bothering to show us anything underneath at all. Instead, it kept letting us see the want, quietly, consistently, episode after episode, right alongside the contempt that was always trying to cover it up. And I think that's rather the most useful thing the whole character ends up teaching, if you're looking for anything to take from it at all tonight. Not a warning about becoming SquidWard exactly, more a gentle nudge toward noticing, in your own life, when the contempt you're reaching for is actually doing the job of covering something you'd rather not look at directly. It's worth checking every now and then, quietly, in your own time. No rush about it. I promised earlier I'd come back round to that phrase, amor fati, love of fate, and I think this is the right place for it. Squidward's never going to get the version of his life he keeps insisting he deserves. The celebrated artist, the adoring crowds, the recognition that finally matches the effort he's put in. The show's not interested in giving him that, not permanently, and I don't think real life tends to hand most of us a tidy version of our own particular dream either. Not in full, not on schedule. What Amor Fati suggests, as a way of meeting that, isn't pretending the disappointment doesn't sting, or talking yourself into a contempt-shaped wall the way Squidward so often does. It's something closer to actually accepting the whole shape of the life you've got. At the failed art shows, alongside the one unexpected afternoon when the band actually came together. The resentment alongside the genuine tenderness underneath it, without needing to edit any of it out to make the story more flattering. I don't think Squidward ever quite manages that, to be fair to him, not properly, not for good. But I think the show, in its better moments, manages it on his behalf by simply refusing to look away from any part of him. The contempt and the want both, the failure and the occasional real triumph. Holding the whole, untidy package together without insisting it resolve into something neater. That's rather what I find myself wanting to take from all this, more than any tidy lesson about avoiding cynicism or chasing your dreams properly. Just a slightly gentler way of looking at the whole messy shape of wanting things you don't have, in yourself as much as in a cartoon octopus. Not fixing it, not even necessarily resolving it, just being willing to take all of it in every so often, rather than only ever managing the bits that are comfortable to look at. There's a particular bit of trivia that I think rounds this off nicely. SpongeBob's own voice actor, the one who arguably has the most reason in the world to root for his own character above everyone else's, has said in interviews that Squidward's actually the one he finds most interesting to watch, precisely because of everything we've spent tonight unpacking, the gap between the performed contempt and the real wanting underneath it. I think that's a fairly strong endorsement, coming from inside the show itself, that Squidward was never meant to be read as simply the obstacle in everyone else's good time. He was built, deliberately, as the one character carrying something heavier underneath the jokes, and the people making the show seem to have known that the whole time, even while they were writing yet another gag about his nose or his clarinet playing. I also think it's worth saying plainly that none of what we've covered tonight is really an indictment of Squidward, even though it might have sounded a bit like one in places, particularly back when we were properly unpacking the resentment of it all. I don't think Nietzsche's diagnosis was ever really meant as a verdict either, not in the sense of condemning the people caught in this particular trap. It's closer to a description, an honest, occasionally uncomfortable one, of a very ordinary human mechanism, the redirecting of an unbearable want into something that feels more manageable. Most of us have done some version of it, probably more recently than we'd like to admit if we sat with it properly. Squidward's just doing it loudly, consistently, and on camera for several hundred episodes running, which makes him an unusually good specimen to study, rather than an unusually bad person. I think, if I'm putting it as plainly as I can after all this, that the most useful thing Squidward's ever done for me, completely unintentionally, several hundred episodes deep into a children's cartoon, is make the whole mechanism visible enough to actually notice in myself the redefining of a thing I want as not worth wanting, the comfortable sameness I sometimes mistake for peace, the contempt that shows up right on schedule whenever I get a bit too close to admitting I'm jealous of someone, rather than simply curious about how they managed whatever it is they've managed. None of that's exclusive to a grumpy cartoon octopus. It's just easier to see clearly on him than it is on yourself, because he's got the decency to wear it so openly, episode after episode, with a clarinet and a stone house, and absolutely no awareness whatsoever that he's been quietly explaining philosophy this whole time. Right, well, that's about everything I had properly worked out on this one. I think it's funny, in a nice way, that a children's show about an underwater fast food restaurant ended up teaching me more about Nietzsche's actual ideas than the handful of half-remembered university lectures I sat through years ago ever managed to. Sometimes, the clearest version of a complicated idea really is sitting in a cartoon, dressed up as a joke about a clarinet, just waiting for someone to take it slightly too seriously on a Tuesday night. It's a strange thing, getting properly attached to a cartoon character's inner life the way I clearly have over the course of putting this together. I don't think that's a bad sign for what it's worth. I think it just means the writers, whoever was in the room for whichever episode, did their job rather better than the genre usually gets credit for. A show about a sponge who works at a burger restaurant managed to sneak in a proper, recognisable bit of human truth, dressed up well enough that most of us laughed right past it for years before it ever caught up with us properly. I don't really have a big closing thought to leave you with, beyond saying I hope wherever you are right now, you're a good bit more comfortable than SquidWard ever manages to be in that stone house of his. If you've made it this far, you're probably long since drifting, which is rather the entire point of these. So I'll leave it there for tonight. I've got a few more of these long ones brewing away. Similar sort of thing, different cartoons, different bits of philosophy. I've got no business connecting them to. So if any of that sounds like your sort of evening, there's more on the way at some point. For now though, get some proper rest. I'll see you in whatever I end up rambling about next.